He probes her presence, challenges her ownership of the vehicle, and warns that non-compliance will exacerbate her situation. His threat is delivered calmly, but is undeniably clear, imbued with the assurance of someone who believes their authority alone is sufficient to command the encounter. What Officer Cordwell failed to realize was that the woman he was pressuring was a law student, trained to identify unconstitutional policing tactics. This stop would quietly subject every decision he made to professional scrutiny, potentially jeopardizing his career. Before we proceed, please share your location in the comments section and ensure you subscribe, as tomorrow's narrative is one you won't want to miss. Jasmine Carter, age 24, occupied the driver's seat while Cordwell stood just outside her window, awaiting responses to questions he hadn't yet earned. She was a second-year law student, dedicating the majority of her days to the study of constitutional law, criminal procedure, and case studies that mirrored encounters precisely like this one. She had been en route home from campus after an extended evening of study when the flashing lights appeared. Now she observed a routine traffic stop morphing into something entirely different. Cordwell neglected to inquire if she knew the reason for being pulled over. Instead, he asked where she was coming from, her destination, and the vehicle's ownership. When Jasmine calmly requested the basis for the stop, he disregarded the question and reiterated his own, this time enunciating more slowly, his gaze fixed on her, as if anticipating a change in her answer. It was a stratagem Jasmine recognized instantly, having encountered it in class discussions, analysis, and debates, a tactic designed to establish dominance before any legal considerations entered the discourse. She provided only the information she was obligated to, maintaining a steady voice and keeping her hands in view. Cordwell noted her composure, which seemed to unsettle him. He stated she had drifted within her lane, a vague assertion offered without specifics, then added that he could ask her to exit the vehicle if he so chose. The statement, though not yet a direct order, was positioned as a test of obedience hanging in the air. Cordwell had conducted similar stops previously. Drivers who resembled Jasmine often reacted as he anticipated, offering explanations, apologies, or volunteering information they were not required to divulge. His body language indicated he expected a similar response now. When it didn't materialize, his tone hardened. He leaned in slightly, repeating his question about car ownership, his emphasis shifting from curiosity to suspicion. Jasmine confirmed it was her vehicle and that her registration was inside, inquiring if he wished to see it. Instead of responding, Cordwell questioned her financial capacity to own it. The question was not posed as casual conversation, but as an expression of doubt. Jasmine paused for a moment, recognizing the subtle shift, then replied that she was a student, and the car was legitimately registered in her name. Cordwell's expression flickered briefly, and with controlled restraint, before he instructed her to keep her responses concise. As he spoke, Jasmine observed the rapid progression toward escalation. He mentioned running her plates again, scrutinizing her license more intently, and potentially summoning another unit. None of these actions were substantiated by his actual observations, yet all were presented as routine procedures. To Cordwell, this was protocol. To Jasmine, it was a discernible pattern. She had studied officers of his ilk, not by name, but by their behavioral tendencies. Officers whose reports relied on ambiguous language, officers whose stops disproportionately involved black drivers, officers whose body camera footage consistently demonstrated a readiness to stretch their discretion to the point of coercion. Cordwell fit this profile, even if he was unaware of it at the time. When Jasmine inquired if she was being detained, or if she was free to depart, Cordwell finally met her gaze directly. He informed her she was being detained pending further investigation. The phrasing was not strictly legal but sounded sufficiently official to most individuals. Jasmine made a mental note of it, as did the small camera mounted on Cordwell's chest. Cordwell reached for his radio, briefly glancing at Jasmine before turning slightly away. This movement was not for communication. It was a deliberate reminder of who controlled the situation. As he spoke into the radio, Jasmine remained motionless, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. She felt no fear, only intense focus. This had transcended a mere traffic stop, and Cordwell, still oblivious to her identity, was already making irreversible choices. The detention officially commenced when Officer Mark Cordwell instructed Jasmine Carter to turn off the engine and place her keys on the roof of the car. His voice was flat, practiced, and confident, the tone officers adopt when they anticipate inevitable compliance. The body camera affixed to his chest captured him formally stating for the record that the driver was being detained pending further inquiry, a phrase broad enough to legitimize almost any action and specific enough to sound official. Cordwell did not retreat after asserting control. He advanced. He positioned himself between Jasmine and the open space surrounding the vehicle, thereby restricting her movement without physical contact. He instructed her to exit, then corrected himself mid-sentence, reissuing the command with greater firmness, as if daring her to question its optional nature. When she asked the reason for her detention, he offered no direct answer. Instead, he repeated the instruction, slower and louder, his eyes fixated on her hands. Jasmine carefully exited the vehicle, complying with every directive, even as the power imbalance intensified. She was now standing outside her own car, her keys out of reach, while traffic moved by slowly enough for drivers to take notice. Cordwell angled his body to ensure she was visible from the road, a subtle yet effective form of public exposure. He repeated his question about her origin. When she provided the same answer, he stated it contradicted his observations, though he offered no specifics. The delay prolonged. Cordwell took her license and registration and moved a few steps away, not towards his patrol car, but to the side, keeping her within his peripheral vision. He remained there longer than necessary, as if anticipating an event. When nothing transpired, he keyed his radio and requested an additional unit for officer safety, his gaze never wavering from her. Jasmine remained stationary, maintaining a neutral posture, offering brief, respectful but not submissive responses. She did not raise her voice, nor did she dispute facts she knew could be challenged later. Her restraint was palpable. Onlookers, and there were now several, expected agitation, apologies, or fear. They received none. A car slowed near the shoulder before proceeding. Another driver casually but pointedly raised a phone. Cordwell noticed, his shoulders stiffening slightly. He adjusted his stance, ensuring his badge was prominently displayed, then instructed Jasmine to stand with her hands behind her back. She was not handcuffed, but her posture communicated proximity to restraint. "Am I being arrested?" Jasmine inquired. "You are being detained," Cordwell replied, as if that distinction alone settled the matter. Minutes elapsed. Cordwell resumed questioning her about the car's ownership, its acquisition, and whether anyone else had access to it. His questions became cyclical. Jasmine answered consistently, and each time Cordwell reacted as though the very consistency was inherently suspicious. The secondary unit arrived without haste, but also without hesitation. Officer Thomas Reed emerged and approached, his eyes shifting from Jasmine to Cordwell, and then to the open car door. Cordwell quickly summarized the situation using vague terminology. Inconsistent statements, suspicious behavior, potential impairment. Reed listened, nodding, but his gaze lingered on Jasmine for a moment longer than Cordwell had anticipated. Reed posed a question to Jasmine that Cordwell had not yet asked. Did she understand why she was stopped? When she replied negatively, Reed glanced briefly at Cordwell. It was not a challenge, but an assessment. Cordwell answered on her behalf, restating the lane drift, and adding that she appeared nervous. Reed looked back at Jasmine, whose demeanor had remained unchanged since his arrival. The presence of another officer altered the dynamic. Cordwell's commands became more precise, his tone more formal. He instructed Reed to stand closer to Jasmine while he re-ran her information, even though it had already been processed. Reed complied, but his posture was less aggressive, his stance angled in a way that did not crowd her. As they waited, a woman walking nearby slowed her pace and stopped, not to intervene, but to observe. Another phone emerged. Cordwell noticed again. He shifted his body to partially obscure Jasmine from potential camera angles, then immediately corrected himself, stepping back as if aware of how that action might be perceived. Reed quietly asked if there was a reason for further escalation. Cordwell responded in an equally low voice that he disliked her manner of answering questions. The explanation was weak. Reed did not argue, but his expression tightened. This was not the first time he had encountered such a rationale. Jasmine was instructed to wait longer. Her identification remained in Cordwell's possession. Time became an instrument. The longer she stood there, the more uncomfortable the situation became, increasing the pressure to resolve it quickly, even if it meant conceding something she did not owe. Cordwell seemed to be counting on this. Instead, Jasmine calmly asked how long the detention would last. Cordwell replied, "As long as it needs to." He delivered this statement for the camera as much as for her. The phrase sounded reasonable. It was also open-ended. Reed shifted his weight and glanced at Jasmine again. There was recognition in his expression, not of who she was, but of how she was comporting herself. He asked if she had any questions. Cordwell looked at him sharply. Jasmine stated she would like to know if there was any evidence beyond the lane drift that justified continued detention. The question landed differently than Cordwell expected. It was measured, specific, and did not sound rehearsed or emotional. Cordwell responded by telling her not to lawyer up the situation, then stopped himself mid-sentence, aware of how that phrase might be interpreted on camera. A brief silence ensued. Reed cleared his throat and asked Cordwell if he wanted him to run the vehicle information independently. Cordwell hesitated for a moment before agreeing. The hesitation was subtle but present. Control, once asserted, now required management. As Reed stepped away, Cordwell lowered his voice and told Jasmine that matters would proceed more smoothly if she ceased making the situation more difficult than necessary. The statement was framed as advice, but delivered as pressure. Jasmine nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. A bystander spoke for the first time, not loudly or confrontationally, but posing a general question about the duration of the stop. Cordwell's head snapped toward the sound, then he immediately regained control, addressing the bystander with forced politeness and asking them to move along. Reed returned, holding the registration. "Everything checks out," he stated plainly. Cordwell took the document, flipped through it nonetheless, then asked Reed if he had noticed anything unusual. Reed replied in the negative, adding that the driver had been cooperative. Cordwell looked back at Jasmine. For the first time since the stop began, he did not speak immediately. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the paperwork loosened slightly. He glanced towards the phones, still pointed in his direction, then back at Jasmine, whose expression remained unchanged. That was the moment the officer realized the situation was no longer entirely within his command. The pause extended longer than anyone expected. Officer Mark Cordwell stood motionless, paperwork in hand, his eyes shifting between Jasmine Carter and the second officer beside him. The body camera continued its recording, its red indicator steady, capturing a stretch of silence that felt more profound than the preceding commands. Traffic continued to flow, and phones remained raised. The tenor of the stop shifted without a single word being uttered. Cordwell cleared his throat and, in a quieter tone, asked Jasmine if she had anything else to share before he determined the next course of action. The question was posed as routine, but it no longer sounded like an order. It sounded like an invitation. Jasmine slowly and deliberately narrated her movements as she reached into her bag. She withdrew a slim folder and handed it to Officer Reed, not Cordwell. Inside were her identification, vehicle paperwork, and a student credential bearing her name and photograph. Reed looked down, then up again, his expression tightening as he read the designation below her name. Law student. Reed spoke it aloud, not loudly or dramatically, but clearly enough for Cordwell to hear. He returned the folder to Jasmine with both hands, then turned slightly toward Cordwell. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. This was no longer a standard detention. Cordwell's posture changed first. His shoulders dropped slightly, and his stance widened, no longer obstructing Jasmine's movement. He took a step back, increasing the distance he had previously been meticulous about maintaining. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, more controlled, and noticeably softer. "Ma'am, I was not aware," he stated. Jasmine nodded once. She offered no elaboration, no explanation. The information had already registered where it needed to. Reed calmly inquired if Cordwell intended to continue the detention or conclude the stop. The question was procedural, but also pointed. Cordwell hesitated, his eyes briefly flicking toward the still recording phones, then back to the documents in his hand. He asked Jasmine if she was affiliated with any legal clinics or externships. The question was now phrased carefully, as if each word was being weighed. Jasmine responded plainly that she was a second-year law student and that her credentials were valid, nothing more. A bystander lowered their phone slightly, exchanging a glance with another person nearby. Someone murmured, not loudly enough to interrupt, but clearly enough to be heard. That explains it. The moment settled into the atmosphere, no longer speculative, no longer one-sided. Cordwell returned Jasmine's license and registration without comment. He adjusted his body camera, angling it downward briefly before repositioning it correctly. When he spoke again, he addressed her as Miss Carter, for the first time since the stop commenced. He explained that the stop was nearing its conclusion and that there had been no issues with her documentation. The lane drift was mentioned again briefly as an afterthought. There were no further questions about the vehicle, nor any further suggestions of escalation. The authority he had relied upon moments earlier was now replaced by caution. Reed stepped slightly forward and confirmed that Jasmine was free to go unless Cordwell had further cause. Cordwell shook his head once. No further cause. Jasmine thanked them calmly. Her tone did not change. There was no overt satisfaction in her voice, nor any visible relief on her face. She gathered her belongings methodically, as if concluding a long meeting rather than experiencing a public detention. Cordwell watched her closely as she prepared to depart. The confidence he had displayed earlier was replaced by calculation. He now understood that the stop would be reviewed not based on emotion or narrative, but on procedure. Every command, every phrase, every delay was officially recorded. As Jasmine returned to her vehicle, Reed glanced once more at Cordwell, then at the body camera, and finally at Jasmine as she started the engine. The glance was brief, but carried significant meaning. This had not been a trivial encounter. Cordwell offered a final statement for the camera, noting that the driver had been cooperative and that no further action had been taken. The phrasing was precise, but it was also belated. Jasmine pulled away smoothly, merging back into traffic without looking back. The body camera continued recording. By the end of the shift, the footage had already been flagged. The incident ceased to be a mere traffic matter before the night concluded. Officer Mark Cordwell's body camera footage was logged at the conclusion of his shift, automatically tagged, due to the duration of the detention and the presence of a secondary unit. A routine supervisory review became mandatory per department policy, necessitating a written report from both officers involved. By the following morning, the stop was no longer being reviewed solely by Cordwell's immediate supervisor. It had been escalated for internal assessment. The review commenced with timestamps. Investigators noted the duration of the stop, the stated reason for detention, and the point at which backup was requested. They compared Cordwell's verbal justifications with the recorded footage, pausing repeatedly at instances where commands were issued without clear explanations and where detention persisted despite compliance. Department policy was cross-referenced line by line, including guidelines pertaining to reasonable suspicion, prolonged detention, and the appropriate use of authority during traffic stops. Statements were collected. Officer Thomas Reed submitted his account, detailing the sequence of events and confirming that no evidence was discovered to warrant continued detention. His statement was factual, concise, and consistent with the visual record. Cordwell submitted his report separately, employing formal language to justify his decisions. The wording was carefully chosen, yet incomplete. Reviewers identified discrepancies between his report and what the camera had captured in real time. The footage was reviewed again, this time by Internal Affairs. There was no commentary during playback, only pauses, rewinds, and annotations. Particular attention was paid to Cordwell's tone before and after Jasmine Carter's credentials were acknowledged. The shift in his demeanor was documented, as was the delay and the moment the secondary officer questioned the justification for escalation. Within days, Cordwell was reassigned from patrol duty pending the outcome of the review. The change was administrative, not disciplinary, at least on paper. His badge remained his, but his authority was curtailed. The reassignment was discreet, internal, and ostensibly temporary in its wording. The department's internal summary referenced prior complaints, not in exhaustive detail, nor with emotional emphasis, but as a pattern. Previous stops exhibited similar characteristics, language, and outcomes. Individually, none had resulted in formal disciplinary action, but collectively they provided context. The current incident became the catalyst for a comprehensive evaluation. Cordwell was formally notified of the findings in a closed-door meeting. He listened passively, offering no argument. He was informed that mandatory further training was required and that disciplinary action was under consideration. The language used was neutral, but the implications were not. His name was removed from the eligibility list for specialized assignments, and his record was updated. His career trajectory shifted direction without public fanfare. Jasmine Carter did not attend any of these proceedings. She resumed her routine the following morning: classes, assigned readings, and deadlines. When contacted for a statement, she provided one calmly, adhering strictly to the facts. She offers no conjecture and avoids personal commentary. Her depiction faithfully reflects the visual evidence, every step of the way. She sidesteps opportunities for media engagement. When acquaintances inquire about the events, her replies are concise. She conveys that the established framework functioned as intended, gradually, with flaws, yet demonstrably. Her attention redirects to her academic pursuits. The very statutes she observed in operation from the less favorable position during a traffic stop now reappear within her textbooks and lectures. Weeks afterward, the department issues a brief public declaration. It affirms that an internal assessment was completed and that fitting administrative measures were implemented. No individuals are identified, nor are specifics divulged. The wording stresses adherence to protocol and public confidence. This is routine. For those within the department, it is adequate. The video clip circulates discreetly. Students of law examine it during their classes. Advocacy organizations cite it in their instructional resources. Law enforcement officers refer to it during their pre-shift discussions as an illustration of how swiftly discretionary choices can morph into legal jeopardy. That instant does not dissipate. It becomes ingrained. Eventually, Cordwell resumes his duties, but not without undergoing a transformation. His stops are subjected to increased scrutiny. His written accounts undergo more rigorous examination. The authority he once wielded without reservation now carries with it a conscious awareness. There are no accolades. Nothing about the resolution is sensational. No one delivers an oration. No one raises their voice in protest. The vindication arises not from a clash, but from the meticulous recording of facts, from official records, established policies, and procedural steps fulfilling their intended purpose when compelled into action. The concluding internal memorandum encapsulates the incident in a solitary sentence. Officer behavior during the stop failed to align with departmental benchmarks. That statement is preserved in the archives. It remains. And in this manner, the narrative concludes, not with retribution, but with responsibility. Should you hold the conviction that accountability ought to extend to all, irrespective of their official insignia, ensure you subscribe to receive narratives of this nature.